The Cuban Embassy in Washington. Carlos Barrier, Reuters, Washington. The Trump administration expelled 15 Cuban diplomats from the embassy in Washington in an escalating response to mysterious illnesses afflicting American embassy personnel in Havana. The expulsions were intended to force the Cubans to operate their embassy in Washington under the same emergency conditions that the United States is now operating under in Havana. The Trump administration decided last week to pare its staff in Havana down to a skeletal group of just 27 people who can carry out emergency services. A State Department official said that the Cuban government would need to give a clear assurance that the attacks would not continue before the personnel in either embassy could return. The expulsions represent yet another step in the administration's gradual unwinding of the Obama administration's rapprochement with Cuba, a reopening welcomed by much of Latin America and Europe, but criticized by many Cuban émigrés from Florida and elsewhere. In a briefing with reporters Tuesday morning, State Department officials said that the Cuban ambassador in Washington was informed of the expulsions in a 9 a.m. phone call. The expelled embassy personnel must be out of the United States within 7 days. By then, the American embassy in Havana will have completed its own drawdown. The actions are in retaliation for a worrisome series of illnesses that began affecting American diplomats and their spouses last December. By late January, the administration had realized that the illnesses were related and may have resulted from some sort of attack, perhaps by a sonic device, toxin or virus. In a press statement, Secretary of State Rex W. Tillerson said the United States was expelling 15 Cuban diplomats due to Cuba's failure to take appropriate steps to protect our diplomats in accordance with its obligations under the Vienna Convention. Mr. Tillerson added that this order will ensure equity in our respective diplomatic operations. State Department officials emphasized that they are not accusing the Cuban government of complicity in the attacks. We continue to maintain diplomatic relations with Cuba, and will continue to cooperate with Cuba as we pursue the investigation into these attacks, Mr. Tillerson said. While Trump administration officials stressed that their action did not amount to a change in United States policy toward Cuba or an end to diplomatic relations between Washington and Havana, the practical effect will be a stark turnaround in the relationship and a return to the days preceding the Obama administration détente, when the two countries' dealings were dysfunctional and fraught with suspicion. Proponents of the move toward normalization said the action threatened to create a new chapter of hostility between Cuba and the United States, playing into the hands of those who wish to reverse the thaw. It would be especially damaging, they argued, if, as some current and former officials suspect, the Cuban government is not even behind the attacks and the chill were to continue indefinitely. If this is not the government, but rather other forces seeking to undermine the U.S.-Cuba relationship, a permanent downgrade would accomplish that objective for them, said Benjamin J. Rhodes, the former Obama administration Deputy National Security Advisor who helped to negotiate the move toward normalization. The number of personnel thought to have been affected has gradually grown over the months, and on Tuesday the State Department added one more to the list, bringing the number to 22. Of the people who have become ill, 17 were government employees and 4 were spouses. 3 of the spouses worked at the embassy. For some, the injuries appear permanent, with symptoms including hearing loss, dizziness, tinnitus, balance and visual problems, headache, fatigue, cognitive issues and difficulty sleeping. Some of those affected reported hearing odd sounds in particular rooms of their homes, leading some experts to speculate that some kind of sonic weapon or faulty surveillance device may have been at fault. The administration expelled 2 low-level Cuban diplomats in May in response to the illnesses, but with more diplomats and their spouses becoming ill in the months since, calls grew on Capitol Hill for a more forceful response. Among the reasons for the delay was that the diplomats themselves, committed to a policy that seemed to be improving lives in Cuba, wanted to stay. Another reason was a growing belief among American officials that the Cuban government was probably not responsible for the illnesses. There was information that the Cubans were rattled by what had happened and were desperate to find the cause. The fact that Canadian diplomats were also affected deepened the mystery. Relations between Canada and Cuba have long been warm. FBI agents who had been allowed entry to Cuba have not been able to find the causes of the illnesses. As part of their investigation, the FBI has also visited the homes of the American diplomats and reviewed security footage but found nothing suspicious. Investigators have been unable to duplicate in a lab the effects the diplomats have experienced. The fact that the Cubans offered to let the FBI go to Havana and investigate was seen as a rare level of openness and another indicator that the Cubans themselves were upset by the episode. The remaining staff at the American Embassy in Havana are enough to respond to emergencies but not enough to provide routine consular services to the nearly 20,000 Cubans who are eligible to get visas into the United States under a deal struck years ago with Cuba. In August, Heather Nauert, the State Department's spokeswoman, said that the department was confident that the attacks were no longer occurring. Officials have since conceded that the remaining 27 personnel in Havana were still at risk.